I think I'm officially calling this panel open. I know that everybody wants to drink coffee and socialize, but we need to move on. And we're moving on with an important piece of this story, and that is the role of the refugees from the Russian Empire for the rediscovery of the Byzantine legacy in the city of Istanbul. And I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague Holger Klein, returning the gesture to him. I think that Holger needs absolutely no introduction in this city and at Paramuseum, but nonetheless, I have to say that he is Liza and Bernard Seltz Professor of Medieval Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, a valued partner of Columbia Global Centers Turkey and of Paramuseum itself. He has curated an exhibition years ago, which features the same Thomas Whittemore, who will be the star of his presentation today. He has been the curator of many exhibitions worldwide, including an exhibition on the Kariye Jami and the Byzantine Institute restoration at the Wallace Art Gallery at Columbia in 2004, and a co-curator of Kariye from Theodore Meadowhitz to Thomas Whittemore, One Moment, Two Monumental Personalities in Paramuseum in 2007. So without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Holger for his presentation for today's symposium.
Thank you very much, Valentina, for this kind introduction. And I suspect I could speak even from my desk. Do you want to start me off? Wonderful. All right. I will speak. Can everybody understand me when I speak in the microphone? I think there's a little reverberation, but I'll try to speak into the microphone so that everybody can hear me. My remit today is to share with you in about 15, perhaps 17 or 18 minutes, a very small aspect of the fascinating story of Thomas Whittemore. Perhaps I should take this mask off. The well-connected Bostonian English professor turned art historian, archaeologist, relief worker, and fundraiser who eventually founded an institution named the Byzantine Institute of America. I will more specifically attempt to sketch Whittemore's intellectual formation and how it shaped the institution that should become his most well-known contribution to the rediscovery and study of Byzantine art and culture in Istanbul. When Valentina and I discovered our mutual interest in Istanbul and the story of refugees from the Russian Empire in the aftermath of the First World War, we were amazed to realize how much the stories of our respective protagonists, namely the sculptor Iraida Berry and the relief worker and Byzantinist Thomas Whittemore, were intertwined and fed from the same sources. Relatively late in his life, in the mid-1940s, Whittemore had commissioned Iraida Berry to sculpt his portrait, which is still preserved here in Istanbul at the American Research Institute in Turkey. And the reasons why he might have chosen her over other artists of the early Republic is very much part of the intriguing story of the refugees who flooded the city following the collapse of the Russian Empire between 1919 and 1923. I'm afraid that the narrow time frame will only allow me to scratch the surface of this fascinating story, but it will at least be a teaser to be further explored in written form and hopefully in visual terms in a future exhibition. So let me start with Thomas Whittemore himself, the charismatic founder of the Byzantine Institute of America, which is justly famous for it received permission by the Council of Ministers on June 7th, 1931, to uncover and restore the known but hidden Byzantine mosaics of Hagia Sophia. And I show you just a few images to highlight what this work entailed. You see Thomas Whittemore here in star shot in front of the building, and then inside with Nikolai Kluge, whose name we've already heard, tracing mosaics and preserving those mosaics. Here too, we see them on the gallery level of Hagia Sophia, and Thomas Whittemore looking over the work of one of the conservators. And here again, in the apse of Hagia Sophia, high up on the scaffolding. So this is the kind of work that Thomas Whittemore initiated. And the work at Hagia Sophia started in earnest later that year, 1931, and continued until about 1948, when the Byzantine Institute shifted its attention to the restoration of another masterpiece of Byzantine art and architecture, namely the so-called Karye Jami. Whittemore was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Cambridgeport as it was known back then, as the son of a well-connected Bostonian family. Here's an early photograph of his. His paternal grandfather had helped to establish Tufts University, or Tufts College, and Whittemore received his college education at Tufts accordingly. Despite his scholarly interests in English literature, Whittemore soon discovered his passion for art and archaeology, likely while he was enrolled at Harvard as a graduate student and attended the wildly popular lectures of Charles Eliot Norton, the humanist and co-founder of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens and the American Institute of Archaeology, a huge personality, friend of Ruskin, and somebody who was a mover and shaker of his time, and very much a universal scholar who was interested in literature as much as in art, and whose lectures were justly famous for that reason. During this time, Whittemore developed a number of lectures on ancient and medieval art that he presented at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Think of it as the intern Thomas Whittemore, who hung out at the Boston Museum and made himself available for guided tours. And it's there where he met Gertrude Stein, a fellow Bostonian, and who, like Isabella Stewart Gardner, remained in correspondence for many years and stayed lifelong friends with Thomas Whittemore. So he was well connected on different levels, and there are wonderful episodes in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas that talk about how they met in Florence in front of the Duomo by accident. And so there is wonderful lore of these various relations. When a leave of absence from his teaching position at Tufts enabled Thomas Whittemore to move to Europe in 1908, he studied architecture at the Sorbonne and traveled widely across the continent. He returned to Europe frequently thereafter, visiting the great exhibition of Islamic art in Munich in 1910, before traveling to Moscow to see the modern art collection of Sergey and participating in archaeological fieldwork in Egypt and under the auspices of the London-based Egypt Exploration Fund. So he was the American representative at the Egypt Exploration Fund at the time. And here's one of those images that show him at this excavation at Abydos and elsewhere. Whittemore's passports are preserved at Columbia University's Bakhmetiev archive and give us a glimpse into his travels at the time. When excavations were cancelled in Egypt due to the outbreak of the First World War, Whittemore witnessed the devastation it caused across Europe and joined the relief efforts of the American Red Cross in France. And I think this is important because that's where he connected to other people who got interested in relief work. Following extensive travels through Russia during the winter of 1915-16, and he went back after coming as a tourist to see the modern art collection of Sergey Chukin, Whittemore ended up founding the American Committee of Relief for Russian Refugees. And as an immediate result of the humanitarian tragedy he witnessed in Russia, that was his response. I will go one step further. You can see that he gives as his address the American embassy in Petrograd. So he was well connected enough to be in that world of philanthropists who establish relief efforts and volunteer their time. In fact, as Remy Labrousse and Nadia Podjemskaya have so convincingly shown many years ago, it was Whittemore's Russian relief work that took him to Constantinople in the spring of 1919 and awakened his interest and passion for Byzantine art and culture in the first place. A year later, in 1920, Whittemore recalled at a Boston fundraiser, and I quote, "I went to Constantinople expecting to find my way immediately to Russia. But it was just after the fall of Odessa, and I found that Constantinople had become a Russian city. The streets were flowing with Russians. There were Grand Dukes and Cossacks and peasants and princes. And I saw there that there was work to be done for the Russians there, for the Russian refugees." And to give you another glimpse into that world, I'm showing a photograph here from the Davis Archive at Harvard. And very much in that world was Charles Davis as well, as a Harvard-trained lawyer who in 1920 managed the American Red Cross relief and took photos and brought his experience back from Constantinople. So that's the world in which the Anna Mitchell, the Charles Davis, the Thomas Whittemore operated in. Among the socialites who served as board members of Whittemore's first American Committee of Relief for Russian Refugees, one deserves particular notion, namely Charles Richard Crane, the eldest son of the Chicago industrialist Richard Teller Crane. Charles had divested himself of ownership in the Crane Company in 1914 to pursue his own political and diplomatic interests in Russia and the Middle East. And Whittemore must have met Crane, although I haven't found that last piece of evidence, in Russia in early 1917. And like Whittemore himself, Crane had visited Constantinople many times before, beginning in the late 1880s. In fact, Crane had become a steadfast supporter and trustee of both Robert College and the American College for Girls, and was appointed to the Paris Peace Conference shortly after the Second World War, and later co-directed the King Crane Commission, tasked to study the fate of the Middle East for Wilson after the Great War, thus making him a politically well-connected and highly influential figure in Constantinople during the last years of the Ottoman Empire and the early days of the Turkish Republic. We've already heard of Admiral Bristol, and it was that connection to Admiral Bristol and to Crane that I think propelled Whittemore in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. Whether it is a ship that is seconded to Whittemore to deliver supplies across the Black Sea to Odessa and other places, or whether it is through the connections and the power that Lord Bristol wielded as the representative of the United States in Constantinople. During his travels in Russia, Whittemore had witnessed both significant political and religious events. In November 1918, he published a story in the National Geographic entitled "The Rebirth of Religion in Russia, the Church Reorganized While Bolshevik Cannons Spread Destruction in the Nation's Holy of Holies," in which he recounted his attendance at the All-Russian Sobor in the summer of 1917 that elevated Tikhon to the patriarchal throne, and described the destruction caused by the revolution. And I quote again, "It is all a vision of the forms and color of the imperial Byzantine court, in which the church on earth pays her for her most splendid homage to heaven." That's in reference to the attendance at the Russian Church Council. By early 1919, Whittemore and his supporters started to define their efforts more in terms of saving Russian culture than to simply provide for those displaced by the war and in need of shelter. So that's the difference between the Red Cross work that he started and the relief work immediately during the last years of the war and its aftermath, and then the pivoting to an effort to save Russian culture. The Committee for Refugees in Russia was thus renamed the Committee for the Rescue and Education of Russian Children, indicating a shift in focus to the preservation of values. Providing an education for children of refugees who had fled Russia, particularly to Constantinople, was now considered a more pressing need than providing relief within Russia itself. And over the next few years, Whittemore decided to concentrate solely on educational work outside of Russia. He saw the creation of a committee focused on education as a way to repel the influence, especially of German culture in Russia. In his National Geographic article, he had described the Germans as desecrators of Russian culture worse than the Bolsheviks. And I quote, "The walls of the entrance to this church, St. Nicholas," and here you see the images, are written over with the most filthy and sacrilegious inscriptions and invectives, not only in Russian, but more significantly of the leadership in all these despoliations in German, end of quote. In an undated speech or letter either written by Whittemore himself or by Seth Garno, the secretary of the New York Committee, the author states, and I quote again, "The Committee for the Relief of Russian Refugees feels that one of the highest duties of the American people will be fulfilled when sufficient assistance is given to the educational movement now being assisted by Mr. Whittemore, to establish schools among all the refugees, who will then look upon America as their intellectual sponsor and will not be compelled to German Kultur, which is even now being presented to them in attractive forms and made easy to obtain," end of quote. It was apparently not easy to convince the Boston Committee for Russian Relief Work that they should shift their focus to educational work. So Whittemore and Garno used the threat of German expansion to rally their support. The committee again changed its name in 1922 to reflect a shift in focus when it became the Committee for the Education of Russian Youth in Exile, and Edward has already mentioned that. This committee initially constructed schools in Constantinople, Bulgaria, and other areas for Russian children and provided textbooks and other materials. And at Columbia, we also have wonderful albums of these grateful students and inscribed in different years by the students to Whittemore and the officers of the Committee of Russian Youth in Exile. Several photographs taken in the mid-1940s and preserved in the Bakatiev archive show Whittemore seated also among a jovial crowd of young alumni of this program in Paris. These photos may be seen as documents of the success of the committee's investment in the children of Russia's intellectual elite, some of whom remained close to Whittemore and found later employment either in the Byzantine Institute Library in Paris, such as Vladimir Rayevsky and Boris Ermolov, or directed the Institute and committee's operations in Bulgaria, such as Boris's brother Dmitry Ermolov. And you sort of see the youth here, the Byzantine Institute Library, and I will show you an image of the Ermolovs soon. Whittemore firmly believed that it was these young intellectuals who would best restore Russia to her former glory. And I quote again, "We are not trying to educate every Russian who wants to warm his back against the school stove," Whittemore wrote from Egypt to Seth Garno in 1923. "We are trying to educate as many as possible of those who matter." Not surprisingly, those who mattered were the descendants of the educated class, as some profiles sent to potential funders back in the United States indicate. In March 1923, for instance, Whittemore wrote to a Mrs. Arthur H. Leah that her aid was to fund the education of one Ivan Tolstoy, a grandson of Leo Tolstoy, and another profile student was said to be a descendant of the Paleologi dynasty of the Byzantine Empire. So that goes into the direction of the Kantakouzenos that we saw in Edward's talk. By August 1923, Whittemore wrote that the committee's relief work in Constantinople was effectively done for. Except, and I quote again, except those already in American colleges, Robert College, for instance, there are no more Russians in Constantinople worth our consideration for education. End of quote. Whittemore therefore started to wind down the committee's relief activities in Constantinople, delivered much needed aid to some of the monasteries on Mount Athos, previously funded by the Russian Tsar and members of the Russian aristocracy, and he rejoined the Egypt Exploration Society's excavations at Amarna in November. By 1927, we find him back in the United States, teaching classes on medieval and Byzantine art at NYU and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. However, he had already set his eyes on a quite different prize. Sometime during the summer of 1929, when Whittemore was apparently back in Istanbul, he hosted a group of 8 influential friends at the posh Hotel Tokatlia. It was likely there that the idea took root to establish what would soon become known as the Byzantine Institute of America. Officially incorporated in Massachusetts and headquartered out of Boston, but with an address and a research library in Paris, the Institute's mission was to facilitate the study, documentation, and preservation of the architectural and artistic heritage of the former Byzantine Empire. As William MacDonald later wrote, Whittemore's message was, quote, that Christian art in the Near East, especially in Constantinople, was unknown, utterly magnificent, equal or superior to Western medieval art, and ought to be revealed and understood better. End of quote. As much as Whittemore relied on his circle of wealthy and politically well-connected American friends to enable the Byzantine Institute's new venture financially, and in terms of facilitating access to the highest levels of the Turkish government, it was his Russian contacts from Constantinople that provided him with the artistic and intellectual talent to staff the organization, so the fellowships paid out. Boris Yermolov was put in charge of the research library in Paris. Vladimir Raevsky, another close friend who initially helped with the Russian relief efforts, served as a librarian. The Russian-born Alexander Piankov had been supported by Whittemore's Russian Relief Committee to study Egyptian philology with Adolf Ehrmann and Kurt Seithe in Berlin before relocating to Paris to further pursue his studies at the Sorbonne. He later oversaw the Arabic and Coptic section of the Byzantine Institute Library and accompanied Whittemore and his small team on the Institute's first project, an expedition to the Red Sea monasteries in 1930 and 31. Whittemore again relied heavily on Russian talent for the Byzantine Institute's second and arguably most prestigious project, namely the uncovering, documentation, and restoration of the mosaics of Hagia Sophia, an endeavor that lasted nearly 18 years from 1931 to 1949. The painter, photographer, and archaeologist Nikolai Kluge, an important member of Whittemore's team at Hagia Sophia, had worked for the Imperial Russian Institute of Archaeology in Constantinople as early as 1897 and continued to do so until its closure in October 1914. Between 1899 and 1908, he was not only tasked with painting color reproductions and taking photographs of the mosaics of Karyajami, later published in Fedor Schmidt's publication on the monument. He had also photographed several important Byzantine manuscripts and monuments in Constantinople, Smyrna, Thessalonica, and Mount Athos for seminal publications of Theodor Uspensky. Kluge was responsible for many of the tracings, as we've already seen, from the apse and the gallery mosaics at Hagia Sophia, as well as their description for subsequent publications. Having witnessed the destruction of cultural monuments during the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13, Whittemore was keenly aware of the need for the preservation of Constantinople's unique heritage. He had already expressed his concerns in a letter to Isabella Stewart Gardner in March 1913, and I quote, "It seems probably that before you have this letter, Constantinople will have fallen, but not, I fear, until all mosques have been destroyed. That, I am told, is the intention of Turkey, to bomb Santa Sophia if they have to surrender." End of quote. During the early and mid-1930s, Whittemore therefore accelerated the production of faithful copies of the mosaics of Hagia Sophia. In an undated letter to Robert Woods and Mildred Bliss, the founders of Dumbarton Oaks and avid collectors of Byzantine art, steadfast supporters of the Byzantine Institute, he expressed his intention to help safeguard these rediscovered monuments for posterity. And here you see some of those team members on the scaffolding up on the gallery of Hagia Sophia, copying the famous Deesis mosaic. The most notable, and this is the letter to the Blisses, the most notable mosaic paintings of 1,000 years of Christendom in the domed Basilica of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul are, as you know, at present entrusted to our care. These paintings, like all forms of decoration we call Byzantine, are compulsory organic part of a building. Unlike easel paintings or objects in museums, they cannot be removed to places of safety. Rather, like the mosaics in the choir of St. Paul's in London, they are unprotected in the path of war. Whittemore's efforts to safeguard, preserve, and popularize these monuments ultimately culminated in an exhibition of such copies as we see here, presented by one of the team members of the head of Christ from that gallery mosaic. Culminated in an exhibition of copies of the mosaics that opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on the 29th of February 1944, at a time when a second world war was fought in Europe and these monuments were again under immediate threat. I'm giving you here a view into that exhibition, which cannot be underestimated in terms of its impact. There was an earlier exhibition in the Brooklyn Museum with copies done by another Russian who we might hear about later on, Dmitry Izmirlieva, in the 1920s, and that very much inspired Whittemore to even think of an institute to preserve the monuments of Constantinople. But this exhibition, funded with State Department funds and opened in New York, in the presence of political figures and State Department representatives, was really a breakthrough moment. And if you go to the Metropolitan Museum, you see one of the great mosaics, namely the Deesis mosaic, as a copy in the great medieval hall, where it is not really seen by a lot of people as works of art, but it is a remnant of this time, and it is a credit to Thomas Whittemore to have brought Byzantium to America. So I will stop here because I have exhausted my time, and I can only tell you that these connections that we heard about the philanthropists getting involved in relief work and then in work of preservation of culture is, I think, a quite significant contribution that Whittemore made in pivoting to value funding, we would call it today, and that this is part of the story, and the seeds that were planted with fellowships and stipendiaries for Russian refugees in the years of 1919 and 1923. So think about that when we are talking about funding for Ukrainian refugees right now, or refugees from Syria, allowing students to attend universities and getting undergraduate and graduate degrees. This is the kind of investment in the future that 100 years ago American philanthropists engaged in, and figures like Whittemore spearheaded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holger. This is an important way of refocusing our understanding of the moment, to ask the question why American interests and American money was focused on the Byzantine legacy of the city of Istanbul, and how through utilizing the Russian intellectual and artistic capital paved the way to creating a different narrative about the city's past, both in the United States and in Europe. So thank you very much for this productive presentation, and Our colleague Sergey Ivanov, also a leading Byzantinist, but from the Russian side, will continue on the same topic. Professor Ivanov teaches Byzantine history in Moscow's Higher School of Economics and is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. He's on a semi-permanent leave of absence from Moscow right now and will begin his term as a visiting professor at Northwestern University in Chicago next year. He is well known worldwide with his contribution to the study not only of the Russian legacy in Byzantine studies, but also specifically on the history of Constantinople, Istanbul, and the Russian contribution to the conservation of Byzantine monuments in the city. And he will talk about Byzantium as seen by the White Russians in Constantinople during the Vyacheslav movement.
Thank you. May I remain seated? Would you give me?
I will remove myself from the screen.
So, during the Ottoman centuries, Istanbul was constantly visited by Russian pilgrims, merchants, spies, and diplomats. Thank you. But even for millions of Russians who never left their country, Hagia Sophia remained a symbol of the Orthodox Christian spirituality. In the 19th century, when the Russian imperialism began to dream of conquering Constantinople, the battle cry, "The cross must return to the dome of Hagia Sophia," became the slogan of the Russian foreign policy. In the second half of the 19th century, the first tourists began coming to Istanbul. This century in general saw the birth of tourism in the parameters very familiar to us now. Russia, with its huge distances and poor communications, was lagging behind the Western countries, but when the Russian tourists began visiting abroad, they always headed west. Constantinople remained largely the trailhead for tens of thousands of pilgrims who were coming there for a day or two, got their documents, and started their way to Jerusalem. Thus, Constantinople was, in their eyes, a shadow of the Holy Land. Consequently, they were shown around by monks, and their interest in the city was exclusively pious. They normally visited Hagia Sophia, but besides were looking not so much for Byzantine monuments, but for modern Greek Orthodox shrines, like the monastery of Life-Giving Spring, the Church of Vlacherna, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. As can be seen, for example, in the sketches by the pilgrim Alexei Kekin from 1888, these pseudo-tourists did not distinguish between old and modern monuments, judging them exclusively by the degree of holiness. Another pilgrim, Ivan Yuvachev, frankly writes in his diary, quote, "The remains of the Byzantine past did not attract the pilgrims if these ruins were not connected to their sacred tradition." End quote. All pilgrims' reports are imbued with ardent hatred of everything Muslim. But even when the secular tourists began visiting Constantinople at the beginning of the 20th century, this tourism was of very strange kind. Nikolai Leikin, a popular satirist of the beginning of the 20th century, published a whole book in 1910 entitled "On a Visit to Turks," a humorous description of a trip to Constantinople. It ridicules a fictitious Russian couple that comes to Constantinople. They do not understand the very idea of tourism, reject all suggestions of their guide, a Russian-speaking Greek, to show them this or that Byzantine monument. For example, they refuse to look at the famous serpent column on the hippodrome because the woman is afraid of snakes. When the guide suggests to see the underground Philoxeno cistern, the wife tells her husband that there is no difference whether they descend there or not. They could tell their friends upon returning back to Russia that they did. The author of the book To Hellas and Constantinople, named Solovyov, complained, I quote, "One can have different attitudes towards the Byzantine art. Some people are repulsed by its conditionality and mannerism, but it makes sense to get acquainted with it nevertheless. This is why it's so deplorable that Kariya Jami does not attract the attention of Russian tourists visiting Constantinople." End of quote. Of course, affluent and enlightened persons also visited the great city on the Bosphorus, but this negligible amount of people did not constitute an audience big enough for a separate tourist guide. Touring aristocrats would use German or French guidebooks in the original. So all Russian language guides through Constantinople, which existed by 1913, were of clerical sort and were normally translated from clerical modern Greek publications. In 1913, the first real Russian tourist guide was published in Constantinople. It was authored by two émigrés, Korkmaz and Maria Skakovska. The former was a Dagestani aristocrat, the latter a Polish aristocrat. Both were Bolshevik immigrants who met and got married in Paris in the first years of the 20th century. In Quartier-Latin, the couple got acquainted with other political immigrants. Some of them were the future Young Turks. After the revolution of 1908 in the Ottoman Empire, the former immigrants became ministers. They invited their Paris friends to Constantinople, and the couple indeed moved there. They became the founders of the first Ottoman trade unions and initiated the organization of the Communist Party in the Ottoman Empire. Very soon it turned out that the Young Turks were displeased with their activity and they were advised to abstain from politics. This is how Korkmaz and Skakovska came to the idea of writing the first secular guidebook through Constantinople. Neither of them was a specialist, but they were well read in French literature. This book is indeed a revolutionary one, since it was written by two people, neither of whom had anything to do with the Orthodox Christian tradition. Korkmaz was raised a Muslim, Skakovska was a Catholic. So the mythology of the Third Rome, the mystique of Hagia Sophia, all this was alien to them, and their guide encompasses in a revolutionary way not only the majority of the Byzantine monuments, but also the old Ottoman mosques. They introduced the notion of cultural, not religious value, as opposed to all previous guides. So the upswing of the patriotic feelings and imperialistic aspirations at the beginning of the Great War led Hagia Sophia to the fore of public attention. The absolute lack of clarity concerning the goals of the war turned Hagia Sophia into the main symbol and the only prize for which rivers of blood were shed. Numerous publications appeared during the war which described the great church and its mystical significance, which was declared as meaningful exclusively for the Russian people. Scholars, clerics, artists, and politicians competed with each other in praising this church, which was not anymore perceived as a mere building. The most characteristic of this in this respect is the brochure Hagia Sophia and Constantinople, this one, authored by Prince Evgeny Trubetskoy and translated into the English language, especially for the education of the Western allies. The catastrophe of the revolution changed the whole picture. In 1920, when the White Fleet shot an anchor in the Bosphorus within sight of Constantinople, its ships signaled a sign of distress, Mayday. This was simultaneously a practical and an eschatological signal. The old Russia was foundering. I make a digression and say that although the parallels between 100 years ago and today are unavoidable, and today Istanbul is also swarmed by people who, prefer to call themselves relocated people instead of immigrants. Still, there can be no comparison between these two catastrophes. The present one is an acute political crisis caused by the whim of one person, whereas the revolution was a downfall of unprecedented scale of world outlook, economy, politics, social, and so on. So the consequences of which are very vividly felt even today in Russia. If you travel around, you see the ruins of aristocratic manners who still belong to nobody. So the question of property, for example, are not settled yet after 100 years. So these two crises cannot be compared to each other. Ivan Bunin wrote of his arrival in Constantinople, I quote, "In previous peaceful years, I have been to Constantinople many times. Now, as if on purpose, I got there for the 13th time, and this fateful figure was not by chance. In the crying contrast with the past, everything was extremely woeful in Constantinople. He was accompanied by prominent Russian Byzantinist academician Nikodim Kondakov. They were traveling together, but he did not feel himself in Constantinople, being there physically. He was not there mentally. In February 20, Bunin wrote in his diary, quote, "We came to the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, squalor and emptiness," end quote. So hundreds of thousands dispossessed and disoriented refugees who swarmed Constantinople in 1920-23 had to rethink anew their life, their history, and even their faith. Some of them blamed the lack of religiosity among Russians for what happened. Among professional historians, such was Georgy Vernadsky. Some other were seduced by mystical teachings like that of Gurdjieff, whose popularity began from Constantinople. On the other hand, many people saw the root of their misfortunes in the Russian history. In a short story on Khalki Island, Alexei Tolstoy describes an officer and under-colonel Izumov sitting in a complete hopelessness on the small island in the Sea of Marmara and blaming the Russian obsession with Byzantium for the present tragedy. I quote, "Byzantium, may it go to hell. So much of our Russian blood has been spilled for this damned Byzantium. It is usual Russian stupidity all over again." End quote. Needless to say, all the refugees regarded as their duty to visit Hagia Sophia. Such visits are mentioned in the memoirs of Любовь Белосельская-Белозерская, Pavel Dolgorukov, Dona Minada, etc. The Russians proudly related that the Turkish janitors did not charge Russians for their entrance, while they were charging all other foreigners. Vasily Shulgin wrote that the immigrants, already mentioned today, deprived of their culture, treated Constantinople as their culture's forefather. But this is only one part of the picture, because side by side with the conservative nostalgia, there was enough of modern and new in the approach to Tsargrad. So it seems that the attitude of the Russian refugees in Constantinople to the Byzantine past of the great city began to change as compared to the pre-revolutionary one. The most interesting for me is the birth of a real tourism. It looks highly improbable. The refugees should know better than divert their struggle from their struggle for survival. And yet, this is a fact. In 1919, when it seems there could be no market for tourism, the guidebook written by Korkmaz and Skakovska was re-edited in Constantinople with recent updates, thus including the developments as late as 1918. It is ironic that on the other side of the front of the bloody Cold War, in the indigent and hungry Moscow, in the same year, 1919, the Sabashnikov publisher printed the Russian translation of a secular guidebook through Constantinople by Jalal Assad, originally written in French. It had been translated by the Byzantinist Pavel Bezobrazov before the revolution. Later, the translator died from hunger. And yet, something urged the publisher, Pyotr Sabashnikov, to print the book. For whom? In all probability for those who planned to flee from the Soviets. In 1921, another guidebook was published in Constantinople, Русские в Константинополе, Le Russe à Constantinople. I did not manage to find it anywhere. I know it just from mentions in the literature. So the refugees were organizing study trips around the city, and the Duchess Zinaida Shakhovskaya writes in her memoirs that her family attended such excursions around Byzantine monuments. I will return to this matter later on. The information about the excursions is corroborated by Fyodor Burtsev, a plain refugee from Armavir, a warrant officer of the White Army, who left an extremely interesting unpublished diary of his 2 years in Constantinople, in Moscow. Kept in Moscow now. It was taken by the Soviets from Prague in 1946. Burtsev shows great interest in Byzantine antiquities of all sorts, and he finds, for example, Byzantine mosaics in the dusty heaps of the Janissaries Museum in Hagia Sophia, and treats it as a piece of art, not as a relic. He also is thrilled by old Ottoman mosques as opposed to pre-revolutionary tourists. The future father of American applied mechanics, Stefan Timoshenko, visits Hagia Sophia and writes about it in his memoirs, accompanied by a tour guide, professional historian Fyodor Taranovsky. The white officer Yuri Meir writes in his memoirs, I quote, "We turned into tourists. Having formed a merry company, we were touring Constantinople, beginning, of course, with Hagia Sophia. But of all the mosques, Ahmadiyya impressed me the most. Of course, all of us were complete neophytes, because in our gymnasia, the history of Byzantine Empire, let alone the Ottoman Empire, was taught very superficially. What did we know? Some information of the ecumenical councils, the heresy of Arius, the heresy of Nestorians, the heresy of iconoclasts. What is it compared to an unmanned valley before the chain of Byzantine walls, which still stands before my eyes?" End quote. It is obvious that for Meir, the education that he had got in Russia looked to him too clericalized, and he perceived Byzantium in a much more lively and open manner. Capitalizing on this new interest in Byzantium, some entrepreneurial Russians opened a new Byzantine monument in the city, the Basilica Underground Cistern. Not that its whereabouts were previously unknown, but it did not constitute a special dot on the cultural map of the city. The Russian businessmen did not bother to be very accurate with historic details. They bought out a plot of land with stairs that led underground, probably add some electricity, and began publishing advertisements in the Russian newspaper Вечерняя пресса. They recklessly proclaimed this cistern to be the remains of the great palace of the emperors. Burtsev, the same Burtsev, wrote in his diary, I quote, "A group of Russian immigrants found an ancient underground palace and began to show it for money to the public. This palace is called Yerebatan. The entrance is from the inner yard of a private house in a back street. A poster in Russian, which announces the opening of the palace for the public, explains that this palace was built by Constantine the Great and restored by Julian the Great. All false, of course. For 600 years, from the day when Constantinople fell to the Turks, the palace was hidden under the earth and nobody knew of it. Also not true, of course. Only now it was found by chance and became accessible to the public. A small door and stone stairs, recently repaired, lead there. The space is electrified. Strictly speaking, only one colossal hall of the palace can be visited, with countless rows of beautiful columns, and the floor is covered with shallow water, sufficient for 2 boats, which cruise around those visitors who want to see all the corners of the huge hall. More precise I wonder what they thought this water comes from, if it's really a great palace. More precise information about this palace is still missing. So our immigrants somehow managed to obtain the permission from the Turks to open this palace and to show it to the public, although in general the Turks are reluctant to issue such permissions. Another practical way to exploit the Byzantine past was chosen by Vladimir Zinder, who opened a photographer's parlor in Istanbul, and for 6 years he was in cooperation with historian Nikolai Mikhailov. They were producing huge albums and entitled Byzantina, Important Antiquities of Constantinople, with high-quality photo pictures of Byzantine monuments, and with explanatory notes in English, translated from the Russian text by Mikhailov. These albums were being sold to Western amateurs of art. It was very strange undertaking because they were typewritten. I had access to two copies of them, one in Dumbarton Oaks, another in the Library of Congress, but both copies are first copies, so it was probably retyped several times, but it was makeshift. I will mention it a little bit later. So the People's University of Constantinople deserves a special digression. It was organized in 1922, existed for not a long time, but played a crucial role in the life of many young Russians. Its founding father was the lawyer Alexei Pozdnikov. His idea was to teach Russian youngsters not only accounting, languages, and law, but also very mundane skills like electricity, massage, millinery, soap manufacturing. So everything that was in demand in Turkey at the moment. No history, no classical philology, no literature, nothing from the standard curriculum of the old university. And this is why it's all the more interesting that Pozdnikov made an exception for Byzantine history in Constantinople. Burtsev, the student of this university, writes in his memoirs, so People's University organized for us excursions around the places of interest in Constantinople under the guidance of one of our docenti, so Nikolai Mikhailov, an archaeologist. So Burtsev, probably these texts in Byzantine albums were just the lectures of Nikolai Mikhailov translated into English for the Western audience. Burtsev was not an atheist, but even his Orthodox Christianity is tinted with critical attitude. When the Russians found themselves living permanently in Constantinople, not passing through it, they realized that Byzantium they had created in their romantic imagination was very far from reality. For example, Burtsev emphasizes that the Feast of Pokrov, the intercession of the Veil of the Virgin, one of the most important and beloved in Russia, and whose emplotment was connected to Constantinople, is all but unknown to the local Greeks. Moreover, the Church of Vlacherna, the place where the miracle of this feast was believed to have taken place, was not famous among the Greeks, so as a result, it sort of existed only for Russian pilgrims. Before the revolution, pilgrims were eagerly groping for underground ayazmata, so holy springs. Now the tourists wanted something much more secular. Finally, to their Byzantine studies. So the old Byzantine Institute of Russian Institute of Constantinople was never back to life, but several people began being interested in Byzantium while in Constantinople. Among them, the most prominent of them was Nikolai Belyaev. He was a very heroic officer of the White Army, and he was doing unskilled labor for living in Constantinople, and somehow fell in love with Byzantine monuments. Then he got education in Prague and became a prominent member of the Russian Institute Seminarium Conducovianum in Prague. Of course, many other areas got also revolutionized, so to say, problematized. So this can be observed in painting, of course, of which many of those present know much more than I do. But of course, the classical pictures of Hagia Sophia drawn by Vasily Ivanov were now bordering with the Alexei Grishenko's cubist pictures of the same building, as well as in literature, where the old moth-eaten imperial ressentiment was now contested by the mad fantasies of Ilyazd, who in his Philosophia turned the great church into the abyss of new and unexpected senses. And finally, Byzantine Constantinople became a topic at which two sides of the bloody and merciless civil war could somehow get together and for the first time try to understand each other. So the young Soviet art historians Nikolai Brunov and Vladimir Alpatov, sent to Istanbul by the Soviet authorities, met with the last remnant of the Russian Archaeological Institute, Nikolai Kluge, mentioned several times today, while the recent soldier of the Red Army, communist Viktor Lazarev, made acquaintance, of which, of course, Nadia Podzemskaya knows much more than I do, made acquaintance with the recent officer of the White Army, Nikolai Izmailovich. So, Byzantine legacy ceased to be an indisputable source of imperial legitimacy and became a counterpart in a dialogue of cultures. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sergey, for this very rich review of the Russian perspective to the same material that Holger addressed. And I would like to start our discussion with the question, why was it so important for the Americans to invest into reviving the glory of Byzantium in Constantinople / Istanbul at this moment of transition, from the imperial past of the Ottomans to the Turkish Republic, and what was the stake of the Russians in this process? Let's just begin with summarizing the gist of this issue of Byzantium during the Beyaz Ruslar moment and its immediate consequences.
Perhaps we'll start with the Russians.
Yeah. Well, we're discussing the American contribution, so maybe you will be the first to speak. No?
Yeah.
I want to somehow undermine the hagiographic picture which you drew. I think that the first intention was to save future Russia from German influence. I think this was very forceful and I think Whittemore wrote it himself, that we should do whatever we can to save Russia from German dominance. This is a real practical thing, so to say, geopolitical thing. The second, I think, was a deep spiritual crisis of the Western world after the Great War. So all values, absolutely everything was put into question by this senseless and bloody war. And I think that Whittemore somehow felt it in the air, but at the same time with him, it was Coco Chanel, to mention just one prominent person, who wrote that why everything I do became reminiscent of Byzantium. So she visited Ravenna, she saw the mosaics, and she began doing jewelry reminiscent of Empress Theodora. So it was also somehow, she knew nothing about Byzantium before, but she somehow felt that the new paths should be trodden. This is my impression. Well, what do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question, because there are, on a popular level, these interests rising that on a scholarly level have been around for a long time. The Germans were interested in Byzantium because of the imperial past. The French too. And the French established a historiographic and philological interest in Byzantium, like the Germans, that led to major investigations and editorial projects. So Byzantium was, of course, always known, and the lure of empire in old Europe resulted in the study of Byzantium. What had to be overcome was the sort of Enlightenment denigration of Byzantium as an effeminate and worthless culture that needed to be destroyed. I mean, one might think of Hegel in the 19th century praising the Ottomans for wiping away that effeminate empire off the map in the 15th century. And that had a long hold in the popular imagination that this was worthless and degenerate. And it is only in the early 20th century that this is counteracted by the study of Byzantium as a culture that can stand on its own two legs. And that also comes out of the 19th century tradition, first in architecture, these feats of engineering that even people who were not very fond of Byzantium could not deny, the sort of enormity of these inventions of a domed space. And so I think what happens with somebody like Whittemore, who's very attuned in that Bostonian context to the collecting of arts that are very luxurious, and is interested in the Mediterranean and tours in the tradition of the Grand Tour to experience all these places, that there is a moment there too that seems to be ripe for a re-evaluation. His interest in archaeology, he dug in Egypt and was interested in Egyptian arts and culture, collected items that ended up in the Brooklyn Museum, gifted by Whittemore. And he was interested in Russia and Bulgaria. His first archaeological haunts were in Bulgaria of Christian excavations. But it is really through that Christian culture of Russia that he sees a living, that visit that I mentioned in 1917, that he sees a living embodiment of that culture that he then tries to find in Constantinople, where the buildings still exist and where the art in Hagia Sophia can be rediscovered. So I think, yes, it's in the air. I think you're absolutely right, and it had to overcome a lot of prejudice, both scholarly prejudice and popular misunderstanding of the culture that was at the cusp of being. I mean, also this is of course another question. The rising modernism, right? Whittemore was the first person who imported a Matisse painting to America. He knew Matisse in Paris, and there's correspondence between him and Matisse, and he drew his portrait. That sort of sense of Byzantium as an abstracted art form that had a lure for that circle of people. I mean,
Isabella Stewart Gardner builds her museum in Venetian guise, but I mean, what is behind it, of course, is Byzantium ultimately. So there is this fashion that meets a scholarly interest. So
and the other part of the puzzle is the entrepreneurial spirit, because both of you pointed out very eloquently to examples of enormous entrepreneurial creativity in this moment, which grabs what is in the air as renewed interest in Byzantium and start money-making operations, whether it's tourists, guides, and some new museums, or creating big museums and public-facing exhibitions, which will monetize this interest. So it's the educational and spirit of the time meeting an opportunity and this entrepreneurial interest. But I don't want to monopolize my role as a chair, and I would like to ask for questions. So first Edward, and then Professor Alexandrov.
Thank you very much for both presentations. I wanted to ask Holger, if you were to describe Whittemore, how would you kind of describe his style? Because I'm very struck by his dress, by his posing for this bust of that he commissioned.
Yeah.
Please describe that. And one just further comment, and I was struck by some of the discussion of sources here. It seems to me that many of the presentations were based on archival material, whether in Bakhmetyev or elsewhere. But I can't overemphasize the importance also of printed sources. And I was just wondering whether here in Turkey, in the National Library or in some of the research libraries here in Istanbul, some of these very rare fugitive publications, small print run, mimeographed, are preserved. I know they're preserved in some of the Hoover Library collections and also at New York Public. But that's a kind of secondary question. And then one final comment with regard to Valentina's question. I think very important are also the religious sentiments or persuasions of some of these sponsors. Many of them were connected with the High Anglican, the Anglo-Catholic movement, or with Episcopalianism, as in the case of Stokes. And as many individuals know, the links between Holy Orthodoxy and Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, go back to the beginning of the 18th century. And so there was a sentiment on the part of religious Episcopalians towards Orthodoxy, which continues to this day.
Perhaps I can address that first bit. Whittemore seems to have been a very vain man. I mean, that's at least the impression one gets anecdotally from people who knew him and who traded that down to their students. And eventually it got to me as well. So I know a couple of people who could not have spoken in more disparaging terms of Whittemore, the man who sort of comes in and shows up and everybody else does the work but gets photographed and gets the press. But I mean, that was his world, right? His scholarship, you know, he's not a trained art historian. Some of the volumes on Hagia Sophia were probably ghost written by other people who had more knowledge, his friends in part, who corrected his manuscript. So if one goes to Dumbarton Oaks, one can sort of get a glimpse of it. Matthew Pritchard was a very important influence. Those people that surrounded him in Boston. And I mean, I couldn't help, I mentioned Charles Eliot Norton today, and that was the model. He was, in college, he was very interested in English literature. He gave speeches on Rudyard Kipling and sort of Shakespeare, and was very much a literate type. But he then started to travel, and I think it is people like Norton who inspired that generation of culturally interested individuals to take up this, the study of art that became a discipline in exactly those years. Whittemore taught at Columbia in the summer session, 1909 and 16, I think, and he also taught at NYU, as I mentioned. And one of the things that is noted, even in the bulletins of Tufts College, is his extensive collection of lantern slides. So he went around and he photographed, and he brought that with him back into the classroom. And that was an enormous asset at the time. And universities were eager to teach their student with those lantern slides, those clunky things that we today discard, and thankfully there are projects to preserve them. But he was an amateur in many respects, but that's how you got trained in around 1900, before there was a discipline of art history that granted degrees. Maya Shapiro is part of that world too, at Columbia, and in a way, these two men met. So it's an interesting story that has lots of tentacles and interesting side stories. But there are other aspects of your question, of course. That
I can add something to the picture of Whittemore. He was extremely vain person, and everybody mentions this when describing him. For example, when he attended the Congress of Byzantine Studies in Sofia in 1934, he proclaimed himself the head of the American delegation, to the outrage of the American Byzantinists who knew nothing about him. They exclaimed, we know him as as an entrepreneur, but not as a Byzantine scholar. What publications does he have, except for which he's signing when he's signing some other people's work? He's appropriating other people's efforts. So it was a scandal. But this was his nature. But I will even probably add something more. When Kurt Weitzman, German art historian, visited Mount Athos, some Russian monks complained to them, among others Vasily Krivoshein, that Whittemore, for all practical purposes, robbed them. So he took very precious icons from the monastery in exchange for food. So he was treating them as European colonialists treated the indigenous peoples, and so he had a mixed reputation on Mount Athos, but probably this is also part of his legacy. That's how he was raising money, for example, for his undertakings, by this not always clean methods, to put it mildly.
One thing about Whittemore I can say, as somebody who studies this moment, is that he's totally ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. He pops up everywhere and in the most unusual disguises and functions. Mm-hmm. But so I think that with all his unclean methods and his vanity, he was the perfect impresario mm-hmm. of whatever cause he mm-hmm. decided to champion. Mm-hmm. And so he had a role, an enormous role, I think, in this moment, whether we like him or not. Professor Alexandrov.
Thank you both for wonderful papers and the discussion that followed. It's clear that Whittemore is an even more appealing character because of all these wrinkles. And I think that a biography of Whittemore is a wonderful idea. Edward anticipated my question to a considerable extent. I was curious about whether or not any of the attraction of Byzantium was in any way a reaction against, let's say, the Western forms of Christianity following their failure to do anything during the Great War, whether it's Catholicism, a high church, or the various branches of Protestantism, and whether, in fact, there was any kind of an attraction for Whittemore or other entrepreneurs or scholars even toward the different religious trajectory that both Russia inherited from Byzantium and that Byzantium had on its own. So was there, do you think, any reaction against the Western church traditions in favor of what was perceived as a different one in the East?
Well, my impression is definitely that this renewed interest is more or less a result of this great disappointment with the values of Western culture in general. This is beyond doubt. As far as religion precisely is concerned, I'm more hesitant, because as far as I see in the documents, this, besides the circle of clerical people who are really discussing what we are going to do with us at the face of this huge crisis, the vast majority of people were religious. I would say that the Russians, strange as it may seem, these hundreds of thousands of Russians, of course, there were churchgoers among them, but not that there was any kind of renewed enthusiasm about Orthodox Christianity as opposed to Western religions. Well, the opposite was the case with some persons like Sergey Bulgakov, who said that Orthodox Christianity failed to save Russia from its tragedy. So let's try Western religion. So he tried to convert to Catholicism, and very, very soon was disappointed with this as well. So no, I have no opinion on this topic.
Perhaps just from my reading of documents and Boris Ermolov tried to write a biography of Whittemore, and it's a fragment. It never took off, but he describes those early years in Russia, this trip that he took in 1910-11, and then the later trip in 1917. And there seems to have been a profound a profound impact of the mystical and the pomp of the church council that he witnessed, that I think goes with his vanity and his sort of appeal to luxury. And I mean, he's a man who really thought that there is something to be recovered of the glories of Byzantium in the study of these spaces. And I think that was the appeal for him, this sort of living tradition in Russia and the sort of imaginary tradition that you get from the sources that describe how Byzantium operated, and the lure of empire that caught him in a way. So I think it goes hand in glove in a way. I mean, it's just as you, the previous question was asked. I also he was the first. If you go through the New York Times Time Machine archive, it's a wonderful tool, and you look for Whittemore. One article that I came across was that he was one of the first people in the 1950s who were on the first transatlantic flight in a jet engine. So, I mean, it's like the first person who buys a ticket on the Concorde. He would probably be the first person to go to space. I mean, that's the kind of personality. And it is wed with this interest in being the first, being the one who is at the avant-garde of things. Yeah, it's
If I may go back to Volodya's question, and I wonder whether there's something in this renewed interest in Byzantium and in a way renewed interest in Orthodoxy or Orthodox culture at the very least, that is connected to the fact that the West or the Christian West, for the first time since the fall of Constantinople, is in possession of these monuments. And so there is a direct opportunity to reconnect with the sources of Christianity, unadulterated, if you will, by all these layers of history and corruption and distortions that separate us from the time of Constantine. So that sense of, especially in the vacuum that is created by the Great War, the spiritual disappointment, this opportunity to go back to the sources and to maybe learn from them something that we have lost over the years. Any other questions? Well, we
see the.
And one, this is the last one because I'm being pointed to that we have to eat.
Thank you very much
No.
Thank you very much. It's good. It's good. It's okay.
No.
No.
close that. Just a.
I'm sorry. It's okay. Yes, it's my problem. Yes, I would just stress more maybe this problem of political involvement of Thomas Whittemore in the beginning, so from the beginning on, because when he is in Russia in 17 and he has permission to cross Russia, Russian Empire everywhere, it's not the case. So he has just political objectives. In this moment, it was problem of entry of United States in the war. No? So it's very, very important his link to the State Department all the time. Yes, and then yes, when he's in Russia, he knows everyone, and yes, this he knows people from of elite of imperial family. Every scholar of Byzantium and of art historians, yes, everybody. And so what was a little bit my addition to the speech of Sergey Ivanov, because I was stressed, so impressed, I'm sorry for my English, I was impressed by this idea, or not idea, but reality that Russian pilgrims or Russian tourists before the First War, yes, they come to Istanbul and they are all they don't see Byzantine monuments, yes. But I think there was something in movement in this time. Because, yes, maybe Russian pilgrims, it's one thing, but it was in Russian cultural society and a big movement to the discovery of these monuments, of this art. And so this is the importance of Russian Empire Archaeological Institute in Istanbul, yes, in Constantinople. And for instance, I can imagine that there were a large, not maybe very large, but so part of Russian society in St. Petersburg, for instance, that could attend the exhibitions, and for instance, exhibitions of aquarellists or watercolor people in 1880s, yes, that are all from foreigners origin. For instance, Émile Villiers de l'Isle-Adam or Luigi Premazzi, and they made a lot of veduta in Istanbul, like Oriental veduta anywhere, yes. And so they work together with Kondakov. So Kondakov asked Villiers de l'Isle Adam to come to Constantinople to work together on his publications. So this I'm sorry. It was also the idea of Russian Archaeological Institute to involve people, to involve artists, and so to diffuse this Byzantine culture in Russia and so everywhere. And it was also before Whittemore. So Whittemore, he understood the importance of this, and he so continued this with the same people and maybe with the same objects that he took in everywhere. So just to ask Sergey Ivanov about the important contribution of archaeological institute. So.
Yes, thank you for your question. In the first review of the guidebook by Korkmaz and Skakovska of the first edition of 1913, published in Russian papers by then very young to become the most prominent Soviet Arabic scholar, Vladimir Gordlevsky. It was his first publication. So in his review of this, he curses, he is displeased with the amateurish level of this guidebook, which was inevitable, of course, because the authors were amateurs. He underlines, he says, this is how he opens his review. He writes, all of us know that we have a Russian Archaeological Institute of Constantinople, but does it contribute to our Russian culture? Does people coming to Istanbul know that this institute exists at all? No, the broad public knows nothing about it, because the Russian Archaeological Institute is completely scholarly institution, which does not give a damn about the broad public. They never publicize themselves. They never try to become visible to the public, and it's a great disadvantage of this noble scholarly foundation. I think we can believe him that so these two worlds were living somehow apart from each other.
Thank you so much for a productive panel. And now it is time to go and eat. So let's give a round of applause. Let's reconvene not at 1:30 because we lost some time, but should we say 1:40? Is that fair?
1:30? Are you sure? It's.
Oh, we are 1 hour behind. I'm looking at Holger's phone.
No. It's
yeah.
1.5. Yeah.
So it's 1:30 now, and we have to reconvene at 2.
It's half an hour.
2:15. 2:15. Oh boy.